So I'm just going to share with you today some product development we've done in the area of diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. And really, with all of our products, in the early days, we kind of made one or two designs, and they've evolved. Mostly in the sport realm, where we took sort of a standard functional design originally that we're all familiar with, and it has evolved in terms of grinds, heel cup depth, components that we've added to try to make it as appropriate as possible given an activity or given some pathology. So this is an area that really needed, I think, to be revamped a little bit and broadened due to the needs of the clients that you see typically. One, I think, is in providing greater degrees of support for individuals. These particular designs originally have been quite accommodative in nature. So an increase in their functional ability, the amount of support they provide, and also some options for the high-risk foot. Typically, these types of designs have been made more for the at-risk, and now we have some new material. So I'll share that with you today. And if you have any questions, this can be totally laid back. You can interrupt, ask questions. I'm happy to answer anything that you may have. These orthoses, both for diabetic, which have been typically referred to as tri-density, and the rheumatoid arthritic devices, have been around since about the early 90s. And at that time, both Paul and I worked closely with a podiatrist in Vancouver named Timothy Calla. And Tim Calla is probably one of the top diabetic podiatrists in Canada. And he had some really novel ideas about how we should construct these. And basically, tri-density referred to a top cover of soft plastizote at that time that created a total contact surface. And sandwiched in between that top cover and the orthotic shell was poron to provide soft tissue attenuation, we think decrease shear. And then the shell material was typically TEP with Fischer foam at that time, or EVA. And then the rheumatoid device was very similar. It had a material called PUF, or EVA, and it had a thermocork shell. So these were very flexible devices, and they were appropriate really for most individuals, I think. But you know, there's really a continuum of functional support or control that's often required. So they really needed to evolve so that we could provide greater levels of control or support to a wider audience, as we've seen more and more of these individuals. So really it started in the early 90s, and both Paul and I did a lot of work casting these diabetic patients for Tim, and we kind of worked together to kind of evolve this line of products. So it was about a year ago, I think, when this project started, and what we were trying to do was increase the options to the podiatrist, to our customers, to have greater levels of support or control, because oftentimes these initial designs that we had weren't providing enough support. And that really creates a very wide variety of options. So we also needed to accompany that with a prescribing form or prescription that allowed it to make it really easy for you to order from us. And so we kind of had two things in mind: broaden the offering in this product category, but also to make it really super easy for you to order from us. Okay? And we have a number of different kinds of customers. We have customers that love our lab standard designs, and I'll use that term. Each lab typically has a set of lab standards, and that we have to have some set design for each product. But we also, over the years, have traditionally been a lab that has many customers that order a la carte. So they kind of like to make their own through us. And so those options are still available here. So the idea was to really create a broader spectrum of support. And I'll explain to you how we achieve that. It's not rocket science. It's just choosing the appropriate materials given the level of support desired. So we have what traditionally have been really flexible devices in the original design, and now we're really adding greater levels of control for foot types that are more flexible, for instance, or those that require more support. So there's three categories now. Originally, it was just really an accommodative category for RA devices and for tri-density diabetic. We've added hybrid and functional categories. Functional being the greatest level of support. And there's about 5 different shell designs, and they'll vary in width and heel cup depth. So you know when you're ordering devices, you always have to think about how deep the heel cup is, because that results in a shell that's wider. And so if you have a narrow shoe, you need to keep your heel cup depth at less so that you're able to fit it into that particular shoe type. So this is the new work order that we created for our marketplace, and I would imagine, I think what's probably going to happen relatively soon is that Firefly will have a similar offering and a similar type of prescription. Does that sound right? I just made that up, but it sounds pretty good. And so what we've done traditionally with prescriptions is try to create it so it's a step process, a logical step process. And I'm going to speak just a little bit about the product options right now. So typically in our work order or prescription on the far left-hand side, you have your device selection. That's the first thing that you typically do. And you'll see here on the left there's 3 categories. There's the accommodative, there's the hybrid, and then there's the functional. I'm just going to kind of walk through each one of those. So this is the traditional design that we used and we continue to carry. And did that guy take the laser pointer? No. So this has worked really well for years. Where you have what we use P-cell now, but soft plastizote is another type of material on the top cover. And this is almost self-accommodating. It typically takes the shape of the patient's foot so that you're creating a total contact surface. And then underneath that layer you have Poron. And Poron, or PPT as it's sometimes called, is a material that's often used as a soft tissue supplement. And the thinking is, although it's extremely difficult to prove, is that it provides some relief from shear forces. So you have a total contact surface and then some shear protection underneath. And then for years we've used an EVA shell or TEP with Fisher foam, and then a bottom cover of thermocork. For the RA device, it's similar in that it has a soft top cover, cushioned 3mm puff. You have this Poron layer in between, and then in this case we use a thermocork shell with a Poron arch fill and a microcell bottom cover. So this is how we've made them for years. But this doesn't support all the diabetic feet, nor does it support all of the RA feet. Hello? Switch. There we go. Okay. So this first category, accommodative, is very similar to what we've done traditionally, and we've just added a couple of new options. So the flexible mold is the traditional design. The standard tri-density is the standard design. We've added a third one for RA called the standard tri-density for rheumatoid arthritis. And the difference is that we're using a new top cover that we've just started to use called Bamboulon. And I'm going to tell you about Bamboulon in a moment. But it's a 3mm cushion material. And I'll talk about some of its specs in just a moment. And then there's the Charcot tri-density. The Charcot tri-density only differs in a minor way between the standard tri-density and that the EVA that we use for the shell is a different durometer. And that's just the firmness of the material. It's a little bit more forgiving for the Charcot tri-density. And then this RA tri-density has this Bamboulon top cover. Now, this is a new material for us. Bamboulon is a neolin, we call it, and it's a type of neoprene that has a charcoal fabric. So it's very long wearing, it's antibacterial, it's antifungal, and it's deodorizing. So it works really great for this application. And it's made without any allergy-inducing chemicals and is breathable and quite durable. So we've decided to go with this versus the puff or EVA, which tends to fatigue quite quickly. it can get quite odorous, and so this just seems to be a much healthier way to go. So bamboulon, that's kind of a cool word, isn't it? Pretty exciting. Now hybrid. So the new categories really are hybrid and functional, and we're just making some slight changes, and it's really to the shell material to increase the amount of support or control. And what we've done over the years is we've having some technical difficulties here, pal. There we go. We've typically used this little continuum to let the customer know how much control or support the shell provides. And so here it's a moderate level of control, so we're going to increase the support versus the accommodative devices. And if you look down here now, you've got semi-flexible devices versus the flexible device that you had in the accommodative category. And the difference is that rather than Fisher foam or EVA, and rather than thermocork as a shell material, we're now using polypropylene. And typically, the thickness of this polypropylene, it'll depend on the weight of the patient, but typically it's 1.5 millimeter polypro. And so now, if you look closely at the hybrid devices, I actually made these slides for Paul. You like how I put the product out there? Kind of neat, eh? Yeah. Now, if you look closely, come on, guys, we have a little fun. It's the last lecture. You'll see this white layer, and that's polypropylene vacuum pressed to your patient's casts. And because it's 1.5 or 2 millimeter poly, it's quite flexible. So it's a little bit more supportive, and that's why we call it the hybrid. And then you have the pour-on arch fill, sandwiching that shell in between the top cover and the bottom cover. And again, we use the bamboulon for the rheumatoid arthritis, and then P-cell for the diabetic application. Okay? I beg your pardon? Well, you because you're going with a thin shell material, you typically need to support it with pour-on. It's actually, they're still quite flexible, relatively speaking, but it helps to maintain the shell shape. We use 100% polypropylene in all of our shells, so they have great memory, speed of memory, we call it. So if you were to bend or distort the shape of the device, it pops right back into its original shape. But this just provides a little bit more cushion or shock attenuation when you couple it with a pour-on arch fill. Yeah. At least that's been our experience. So then there's the functional category, which you see down here, the bottom of the left side. And now we're going to increase the support with more of a semi-rigid type of shell material to give you a greater degree of support or functional control. And so here now you'll see polypropylene, polypropylene, polypropylene for the shell material. And again, it will be adjusted, the thickness of that material, in order to match the patient's body weight so that we get a functional output of, more of a greater level of control. And so these look very similar to the hybrid. Now we're just using a thicker material to achieve that stiffness or increased support. So that's pretty basic stuff. So the key really is for the practitioner to think, okay, what level of support would I like to have given this presentation, whether it's a rheumatoid arthritic patient or whether or not it's a diabetic patient. And then you can just simply order that product based on the functional level of control. Now, the other thing that needed to evolve or develop was around the high-risk foot and those people that may or may not have an ulcer at the time. And so the second step would be to select your ultra protective top cover material. You like that? Ultra protective. And we brought in some new materials in order to achieve this, and they're called Astroform and Astrozorb. And I'm just going to describe those to you a little bit more. So if you think about the lab standard designs that do not have the ultra protective top cover, P cell is typically the top cover on the diabetic device, and in this case it's replaced by this AstroZorb. And it's a closed cell structure that has it has hygienic properties and can be disinfected quite nicely. So the applications, which I'll go over in a moment, one is for people who have an ulcer, so they're high-risk feet. The AeroZorb is, the Astroform replaces the poron layer. So it has great attenuation features, or it's very good for diffusing both pressure and shear. So we're just using a slightly different top and middle cover combination now with the ultra protective top cover. So the applications here are the individual who's very high risk, who has an open ulcer, where you really want to achieve a total contact surface. And then for those individuals with diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis who have fragile skin conditions, also with the rheumatoid arthritic patients that have ultra-sensitive feet. So you want an ultra-protective top cover if you have ultra-sensitive feet. Okay? It's quite epic, isn't it? So that's the other thing that we've added. So for prescribing these, the process and our sort of logistics around ordering follow this pattern typically. The first step is to choose a device, and you're going to be thinking about what's the functional level of support that you'd like given the patient presentation. In this situation, it would be either a diabetic or somebody who has rheumatoid arthritis, and you know, for instance, that the accommodative design and components and materials are not going to provide this individual with enough support, so you select either a hybrid or a functional design. Then you want to think about, okay, do I need to consider the ultra protective top covers, the Astroform and AstroZorb? And then there's a difference in how we do the cast corrections. Is everybody familiar with cast corrections? What we do to your cast prior to pressing a shell? Has anybody dressed a cast here? In school, maybe? Okay. So, and we talked about this a little bit this morning, and it is difference between foam box and neutral suspension cast technique, but let's assume it's neutral suspension cast technique. If you're doing a neutral suspension cast, that's obviously taken in non-weight bearing. So the lab typically applies plaster, or in this case, we usually do manual cast dressing, the traditional way, versus automation. In either case, we have to add some material onto that positive cast or model prior to vacuum pressing the shell. If we didn't, we wouldn't be allowing for soft tissue expansion and weight bearing. So with the diabetic devices, we use what's called a type 1 cast dressing, and that's the least amount of dressing that we apply to a cast. So we really want a total contact surface when we're dealing with the diabetic patient, so we use less fill or less cast dressing when we prepare that cast. Conversely, the RA patient doesn't typically like a total contact surface. They are often not tolerated and a little too aggressive, so we use a type 2 cast dressing for the RA device. So there's a little bit of difference in how we prepare the cast prior to pressing the shell. And then after you've made kind of those decisions, functional level of control based on patient presentation, do I need to have some ultra protective top covers? Then you have all the other components that you typically would have with a prescription. If you want to add components to the forefoot to offload different areas, if you want to add other types of support, metatarsal support, all of those things are still available. Okay? So, how did I do? Not bad, eh? 16 minutes or 17? Yeah. So I think that this type of offering will be likely available through Firefly at some time in the future. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Or I can certainly direct you to somebody at Paris who can.